The mountain air is still cold when the Italian line breaks. After hours of artillery, rifle fire, and shouting across the ravines near Adwa, the sound changes. It is not quieter, it is worse. The controlled thunder of an advance, collapsing into the panic of men who realize they are exposed, separated, and being closed in from the heights. Italian brigades meant to support one another are scattered across broken ground. Smoke settles in the folds of the land. Ethiopian fighters surge down the slopes, some carrying modern rifles, others spears and shields, fighting for something larger than territory. They are fighting to keep Ethiopia independent. And somewhere inside that vast Ethiopian force is a woman Europe never expected to matter this much. The familiar version of Adwa is simple. Emperor Menelik II rallied Ethiopia and defeated an invading European army. True, but incomplete, because Empress Taytu did not merely stand beside victory. She recognized the threat early, resisted compromise, and helped turn diplomacy, supply, terrain, and political resolve into weapons. To understand why Italy's army collapsed on this mountain morning in March 1896, we need to go back before the gunfire. Back to a piece of paper, a mistranslation, and an empire that believed Ethiopia could be taken. By the late 19th century, the map of Africa was being torn open by Europe. Britain, France, Germany, Belgium, Portugal, Italy, one by one, they are carving claims across the continent with treaties, companies, armies, and lies. This is the age of the scramble for Africa, when conquest is dressed up as commerce and annexation as civilization. In European capitals, African independence is increasingly treated not as a right, but as a delay. Italy is younger than the older empires, recently unified, hungry for prestige, sensitive to humiliation, desperate for colonies that will prove it belongs among the great powers. It has already planted itself on the Red Sea coast, in what becomes Eritrea. But a coastal foothold is not enough. Rome wants the highlands beyond it. Rome wants Ethiopia. Ethiopia is not an easy prize. It is old, armed, Christian at its core, but politically diverse, fractured in places, yet still sovereign, governed through shifting alliances of nobles, regions, languages, and loyalties. It has been battered, contested, and reassembled many times before. At its center rises Emperor Menelik II, a ruler in his early 50s by the time of Adwa. Patient, politically supple, often pragmatic to the point of seeming slow, and far more dangerous than outsiders realize. He is building power, centralizing rule, buying modern weapons, balancing rivals, negotiating with Europeans without ever forgetting what Europeans want. And beside him is Taytu Betul. She is in her early 40s, aristocratic by birth, church-educated, intellectually formidable, known for a sharp mind and a sharper tongue. She is not ornamental. She understands rank, memory, insult, and leverage. She is capable of warmth, but not softness where sovereignty is concerned. She has already lived enough life to know what men in power sound like when they promise friendship and mean possession. She has no child of her own, but she moves inside the royal family not as a passive consort, but as a force. Later generations will remember her as co-founder of Addis Ababa, as political actor, as controversial power behind the throne, as woman too commanding for some of the men around her to forgive. All of that is part of the story. But the core of her legend begins with the moment she recognizes what Italy is trying to do. In 1889, Ethiopia and Italy signed the Treaty of Wuchale, or Wichale. On paper, it is a treaty of friendship and commerce. In reality, one clause becomes a loaded weapon. Article 17 does not say the same thing in both languages. In the Italian version, Ethiopia is effectively made a protectorate, bound to conduct foreign affairs through Italy. In the Amharic version, that arrangement is optional. Optional and compulsory are not minor differences. They are the difference between alliance and subjugation. For Italy, the mistranslation is an opportunity. For Ethiopia, once the discrepancy is understood, it is an insult wrapped around an attempted theft. This is where Taytu steps out of the margins of the usual story. She is remembered in Ethiopian and later historical accounts as one of the people who grasped immediately that the treaty was not just flawed, but dangerous. Menelik tries diplomacy first. He denounced the treaty in 1893. He writes, negotiates, maneuvers. Italy does not back down. Why would it? In Rome, officials convince themselves that Ethiopia can be pressured, divided, or defeated. They misread Menelik's patience as weakness. They misread Taytu's prominence as an eccentricity. They misread the country itself. And Taytu, according to accounts preserved afterward, is not interested in politely surviving the lie. She is said to have answered Italian dignity with a warning about Ethiopian dignity. That distinction matters, because the war that follows is not simply a border quarrel. It is a collision between two political imaginations. One believes Africa can be folded into Europe's future by force. The other refuses to disappear. War does not begin in a single burst. It accumulates, skirmishes deepen. The Italian colonial army pushes inland from Eritrea. Menelik begins a general mobilization. Across Ethiopia, nobles answer the call with their own followers. Ras Makonnen, disciplined and capable. Ras Alula, seasoned and relentless. Ras Mengesha, Negus Tekle Haymanot. Ras Mikael, with Oromo cavalry, and many others. Priests carry tablets and blessings. Blacksmiths work iron. Pack animals are loaded. Powder, grain, tents, shields, spare sandals, bandages, church banners, cooking vessels. War is not only columns and commands. It is also the enormous labor of keeping tens of thousands alive long enough to fight. And women are everywhere in that labor. Not in the footnotes, in the bloodstream of the campaign. They haul grain, carry water, treat the wounded, set up camps, manage movement. Some fights, some keep brothers, husbands, sons and lords from starving on the march. In a campaign that draws people from across an enormous and difficult country, logistics become destiny. For men marching from the south toward the northern highlands, the distances are punishing. For many, the journey runs hundreds of miles. The army that gathers under Menelik is often described at around 100,000 fighters, with an even larger moving world of servants, clergy, camp followers, and support. It is less a marching column than a migrating state. Taytu does not stay behind in safety while this happens. Sources credit her with bringing her own substantial contingent, often described as numbering in the thousands, and with taking a direct role in provisioning, care for the wounded, and the moral force of the campaign. Some accounts go further and link her to efforts to deny the Italians access to fresh water in a dry and exposed landscape, a detail repeated so often because it fits her reputation perfectly. Political intelligence turned into tactical pressure. Whether every later retelling preserves the battlefield exactly as it happened is still debated by historians. But the larger point stands. Taytu thought about war operationally. She understood that an army can be broken long before its last line gives way. By early 1896, both sides were under pressure. The Ethiopian host is massive, but mass consumes food. Menelik cannot keep such a force in the field forever. He needs resolution before hunger starts dissolving unity. On the Italian side, General Oreste Baratieri commands roughly 14 to 15,000 men, Italians and Eritrean askari, facing an opponent far larger than Rome had imagined. Baratieri is not a fool. He knows the balance is bad. He knows the terrain favors the defenders. He knows caution. But back in Italy, Prime Minister Francesco Crispi and the political class want a victory, not an excuse. Prestige is on the line. So is Baratieri's career. He is pushed toward action by men who will not be the ones climbing the rocks in the dark. Adwa sits in the Tigrayan highlands, north-central Ethiopia, in a landscape that does not forgive bad assumptions. This is a country of ridges, broken slopes, gullies, sudden folds in the earth, jagged horizons, narrow tracks, and deceptive distances. A mountain that looks close in dawn haze may take far longer to reach than a flatland officer expects. A brigade can vanish behind a ridge and become its own doomed island. Visibility is partial, coordination is fragile. Artillery can command a slope and lose a valley. Maps matter, so does local knowledge. So does who holds the heights when the sun comes up. Baratieri's plan is bold in the way desperate plans often are. He will march by night. His brigades will move in parallel across the broken terrain, seize key high ground, and strike the Ethiopians before that huge army can deploy coherently. On paper, it promises discipline, surprise, and mutual support. In the dark, over rough ground, with imperfect maps, it begins to come apart. The names of the brigade commanders matter because their separation becomes the shape of the disaster. Albertoni on one flank, Arimondi in the center, da Bormida on the other, Elena with the reserve. They are supposed to move as parts of a single machine. Instead, the machine stretches, stumbles, and loses alignment in the mountains before dawn. Albertoni's men, including large numbers of Eritrean askari, press too far and toward the wrong ground. The distances widen, runners are delayed, landmarks deceive. By first light, the columns are no longer supporting one another. They are exposed across several miles of punishing country. Now picture the other side of that dawn. Ethiopian scouts are not reading the landscape from sketches. They know how sound travels here, how dust hangs, how a column reveals itself against a slope. They see movement where movement should not be. They recognize an opportunity no defender can ignore. The invader has come up the mountain in pieces. The first real shock hits Albertoni's brigade in the early morning. Fire cracks from the heights. Ethiopian attacks surged against men who had expected to secure a position, not fight immediately for survival. Italian artillery does what artillery often does in the first moments of a well-trained colonial army under pressure. It buys time with violence. Shells burst, bodies drop, slopes shudder with impact. But artillery is only useful if the line around it remains intact, and the line is already fraying. This is the point in many popular sayings where Adwa becomes a blur of bravery. It should not. The battle is understandable, and understanding makes it more astonishing. The Italians are not simply overwhelmed by numbers in an abstract sense. They are overwhelmed because the terrain has broken their plan, and because the Ethiopians exploit that break with speed. Menelik's commanders do not all throw themselves blindly at guns. They press isolated brigades. They use the folds of the land. They attack from dominating heights. They accept terrible casualties and keep coming because they know each separated column can be crushed before another can rescue it. This is not chaos replacing order. It is one form of order defeating another. Around the battlefield, the human scale of this war is brutal. A young Ethiopian rifleman who has marched for weeks now finds himself climbing into smoke over ground slick with dust and blood, firing at uniforms he has only known from rumor. A woman behind the line pours water into the mouth of a wounded cousin, then moves to the next man because there is no time to mourn yet. An Eritrean askari in Italian service hears orders in one direction and gunfire from another, and understands, with a clarity that lands like cold metal in the stomach, that his brigade has gone too far. An Italian officer from the peninsula, who believed he was marching toward a manageable colonial engagement, looks up and sees entire hills moving. Taytu's presence belongs in this world, not above it. She is not the whole battle. No serious reading of Adwa allows that fantasy. Menelik commands the army. His generals fight in the field. The scale of victory is collective. But Taytu is also not incidental. She is part of the command environment that made war politically unavoidable, part of the mobilization that made resistance possible, part of the apparatus that kept the Ethiopian side functioning, and, in Ethiopian memory, part of the strategic pressure applied to the Italians when water and endurance mattered as much as gunfire. Even her enemies noticed her force of personality. Even Italians who resented her remembered her. As the morning deepens, the battle spreads. Albertone's position buckles first under sustained pressure. Arimondi's men fight hard in the center, using artillery and disciplined volleys to hold off repeated assaults. For a time, the issue is not yet settled. This matters. Adwa is not a magical collapse of European arms. The Italians inflict enormous losses. Ethiopian dead and wounded rise by the thousands. Men are cut down on the approach, on the crest, in the recoil from failed charges. The victory is paid for in bodies. Then comes the moment that changes the scale of the day. Menelik releases reserve forces, thousands of fresh fighters from Shewa who had not yet been spent in the morning's attacks. It is the kind of decision that only matters if a commander has held something back long enough to matter. Under that new pressure, the Italian center cannot stabilize the battle. The separation between brigades becomes fatal. The reserve cannot glue together ground that no longer connects. Once a line loses its shape in terrain like this, defeat accelerates. Retreat routes narrow. Orders arrive too late. Ammunition runs unevenly. Wounded men become obstacles. Units that believe support is coming discover empty ridges. Oromos, under Ras Mikhail, strike hard. Dabomida's brigade, trying to maneuver in support, is drawn into catastrophic fighting of its own. By noon, the retreat is sounding. By then, for many, retreat is only another word for being hunted through ravines. The action turns immediate, visual, savage. Italian formations dissolve under pursuit. Men tumble down rock slopes under rifle fire. Officers try to form squares or rearguards in ground that makes neat geometry impossible. Bayonets and spears appear at close range. Horses lather and fall. Drums, prayers, screams, trumpet calls, smoke, dust, sunlight flashing on metal. Then the terrible openness after command fails, when every small group is alone inside the larger collapse. This is the dramatic center of the story, but not the whole truth. Because battles do not end when noise stops, they end when people walk through what the noise has done. By the time Adwa is over, more than 6,000 Italian and colonial troops are dead, and thousands more are captured. Some estimates put Italian losses so high that roughly 7 in 10 of their soldiers were killed or taken. Ethiopian losses are also appalling, well over 5,000 dead in some accounts, and thousands more wounded. The field is not a clean symbol. It is a place of thirst, shattered bone, ripped cloth, abandoned guns, and men calling for water in languages the mountain does not care about. And the dead are not all remembered equally. Italian soldiers die in a failed imperial campaign launched under pressure from politicians far away. Eritrean askari died fighting for a colonial army against another African power, trapped inside the brutal logic of empire. Ethiopian fighters die defending sovereignty in one of the most consequential anti-colonial victories of the century. Women move through the aftermath with the old duties of war, searching, lifting, washing wounds, identifying bodies where they can. Priests pray, survivors scavenge ammunition and blankets. The victorious army, like every army after battle, smells of sweat, blood, powder, mud, and exhaustion more than glory. Then the political meaning starts to harden. Italy has been humiliated, not inconvenienced. Humiliated. A European power marched inland, expecting prestige, and received catastrophe. In the age of empire, that fact travels fast. Ethiopia's victory echoes far beyond the battlefield. Across Africa and the black diaspora, Adwa becomes proof that European conquest is not inevitable, that white supremacy is not destiny dressed as history. In October 1896, the Treaty of Addis Ababa formally ended the war and forced Italy to recognize Ethiopian independence. The protectorate claim built into the earlier treaty is dead. This is the part where legend usually seals itself. Menelik, the victor; Adwa, the miracle. Ethiopia is the exception. But history is always larger and less comfortable than legend. Adwa did not end imperial ambition forever. It did not make Ethiopia untouchable. 4 decades later, Mussolini would invade, driven in part by the desire to erase the shame of this defeat. Adwa also did not freeze Ethiopia into a perfect unity beyond politics. The empire Menelik strengthened had its own internal hierarchies, conquests, and unresolved fractures. Great victories do not purify states, they reveal their strengths while leaving their contradictions intact. And Taytu's story is often distorted in 2 opposite directions at once. In one version, she is reduced to an emperor's wife, a dramatic footnote, standing near greatness but not shaping it. In another, she becomes a solitary mastermind who wins Adwa almost by herself, as though an army of perhaps 100,000 people, multiple regional commanders, and months of mobilization were incidental. Both versions are smaller than reality. The real Taytu is more interesting than either myth. She is a political actor whose anti-colonial instincts were sharper than many around her. She is a woman who helped identify the mortal danger in a treaty others hoped could be managed. She is a force in the imperial court, a strategist of morale and logistics, a battlefield presence linked in historical memory to water denial, medical organization, and direct command responsibilities. She is also controversial, ambitious, feared by some Ethiopian elites, admired by others, too powerful to fit comfortably inside later narratives that preferred great men with supportive wives. The silence around her is not accidental. History often narrows women into symbols after they have done the harder work of being participants. So when people ask whether Empress Taytu helped defeat Italy, the answer is yes, but not in the flattened way legend likes. She did not single-handedly win against Adwa. She helped make an Ethiopian victory possible in the years, decisions, and preparations that led to it, and in the practical machinery that held resistance together when war came. She mattered before the first shot, during the campaign, and in the political meaning of the victory itself. That is why the untold story matters, because Adwa was not only a battlefield triumph, it was an argument about who gets to speak for Africa, who gets written out of victory, and how power hides itself inside the word famous. Menelik became the face of the win, and rightly so in part. He was emperor, he commanded the coalition, but behind the face of victory stood Taytu, refusing the protector's language, seeing the empire clearly, and helping turn indignation into organized resistance.